6 months after his humiliating encounter at Windsor Castle, Marcus Thompson stood in front of the bathroom mirror in his London flat, preparing for what would be the most important day of his adult life. The face looking back at him was thinner than it had been in June, marked by lines of worry and stress that hadn't been there before, but also by something else, a clarity in his eyes that he was still getting used to. The legal consequences of his confrontation with Sergeant Chun had been severe but fair. He had pled guilty to all charges and received 6 months of community service, a substantial fine, and a restraining order requiring him to stay away from all royal properties. More significantly, the publicity surrounding his arrest had destroyed his restaurant empire almost overnight. The story had spread like wildfire across social media. Video footage of Marcus being effortlessly subdued by a woman half his size while he screamed threats and demands had been viewed millions of times. The contrast between his arrogant bluster and Sergeant Chin's calm professionalism had made him a symbol of everything people despised about entitled bullies. Within a week of his arrest, customers had stopped coming to his restaurants. Within a month, his business partners had distanced themselves from him. Within 3 months, he had been forced to sell all 3 establishments at significant losses just to pay his mounting legal fees and avoid bankruptcy. Marcus had lost everything he thought mattered: his money, his reputation, his power over other people. But in losing those things, he had gained something unexpected: the opportunity to discover who he actually was beneath all the posturing and intimidation. This morning, Marcus was preparing for his last day of community service at the Riverside Community Center in East London. For 6 months, he had spent every Saturday working with at-risk youth, helping to maintain the center's facilities and assisting with various programs. It was work he would never have considered before his arrest, work that paid nothing and offered no opportunities for profit or advancement. It was also the most meaningful work he had ever done. Marcus pulled on a worn t-shirt and work boots, clothes that 6 months ago he wouldn't have been caught dead wearing. His expensive suits hung in his closet, relics of a previous life that felt increasingly distant. He had kept one good suit for job interviews, but even that felt like a costume now, clothing from someone else's life. The community center was a converted warehouse in a part of London that Marcus's previous social circle would have crossed the street to avoid. The building was old and showed its age, but it was clean and well-maintained, largely through the efforts of volunteers like Marcus who had given their time to keep it running. When Marcus arrived, he found the usual Saturday morning crowd of volunteers preparing for the day's activities. There was Mrs. Patterson, a retired teacher who ran literacy programs. There was Jerome, a former gang member who now worked with teenagers trying to stay out of trouble. There was Sarah, a single mother who organized food distribution for families in need. 6 months ago, Marcus would have looked at these people and seen failures, individuals who had to volunteer their time because they lacked the success and wealth that would have given them better options. Now he saw them differently. They were people who had chosen to spend their free time making their community better, not because they had to, but because they believed it was important. "Morning, Marcus," called Jerome as Marcus picked up his toolkit. "Ready for your last day?" "Ready as I'll ever be," Marcus replied, though he wasn't sure that was true. His final community service project was helping to renovate the center's main meeting room. The space was used for everything from job training programs to birthday parties for families who couldn't afford to rent venues elsewhere. The work was simple but important: painting walls, installing new lighting, replacing worn carpet with donated flooring. As Marcus worked, he found his mind drifting back to the conversation he'd had with Sergeant Chin 6 months earlier. She had told him that apologizing wasn't enough, that he needed to figure out what kind of person he wanted to be going forward. At the time, he hadn't really understood what she meant. Now, after 6 months of working alongside people who had dedicated their lives to serving others, he was beginning to get it. Around midday, Marcus was installing new light fixtures when a commotion in the main hallway caught his attention. Through the open door, he could see a group of children excitedly clustered around someone, their voices raised in excitement. "Is it really you?" one of the kids was asking. "Are you really a soldier?" Marcus stepped into the hallway to see what had captured the children's attention, and his heart nearly stopped. Standing in the center of the group, smiling patiently as children peppered her with questions, was Sergeant Sarah Chun. She was wearing civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple sweater, but Marcus recognized her immediately. The calm confidence, the alert eyes, the way she carried herself with quiet authority. She looked exactly as she had 6 months ago, except now she was surrounded by a dozen children who were treating her like a celebrity. "I am a soldier," she was saying to a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. "But today I'm just Sarah, and I'm here to help with your reading program." Marcus ducked back into the meeting room, his heart racing. What were the chances that Sergeant Chun would show up at his community service location on his very last day? Part of him wanted to hide until she left, to avoid the awkwardness of another encounter. But a larger part of him recognized this as an opportunity he might never get again. He had thought about Sergeant Chin often over the past 6 months, not with resentment or anger, but with something approaching gratitude. Their confrontation had been the catalyst for the most difficult and most important period of his life. She had shown him who he really was, and in doing so, she had given him the chance to become someone better. Marcus finished installing the light fixture he was working on, cleaned up his tools, and walked into the hallway. Sergeant Chun was now in the reading room, helping children with their homework. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and, for a moment, their eyes met. "Mr. Thompson," she said with a slight nod of recognition. "Sergeant Chun, I didn't expect to see you here." Several of the children looked between them curiously, sensing that the two adults knew each other somehow. "I volunteer here once a month," Sergeant Chin explained. "I help with the literacy program. Mrs. Patterson didn't mention that you were doing your community service here." Marcus felt a flush of embarrassment. Of course she would know that he was here as part of his legal sentence, not as a genuine volunteer. "Today's my last day," Marcus said. "And what happens tomorrow?" It was a simple question, but it cut right to the heart of what Marcus had been wrestling with for weeks. His community service was ending, his legal obligations would be fulfilled, and he would be free to return to his old life. Except his old life no longer existed, and even if it had, he wasn't sure he wanted it back. "I don't know," Marcus said honestly. One of the children, a boy of about 10, looked up from his reading book. "Are you in trouble, mister?" Marcus looked down at the child, whose direct question demanded an honest answer. Marcus said. "I did something very wrong, and I had to come here to help out as a punishment." "But you're not in trouble anymore." "No, I'm not in trouble anymore." "So why do you look sad?" Out of the mouths of babes, Marcus realized that he did feel sad, but not for the reasons he might have expected. He wasn't sad about losing his money or his restaurants or his reputation as someone to be feared. He was sad because his time at the community center was ending, and he wasn't ready to leave behind the sense of purpose he had found here. "I'm sad because I'm going to miss this place," Marcus said. "I'm going to miss helping people." The boy nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Then, why don't you just keep coming?" Sergeant Chun was watching this exchange with interest, and Marcus could see that she was evaluating him the same way she had 6 months ago. But this time, instead of assessing him as a potential threat, she seemed to be measuring his sincerity. "That's a good question," she said to the boy. Then, to Marcus, "Why don't you just keep coming?" Marcus looked around the reading room, taking in the mismatched furniture, the donated books, the bulletin board covered with children's artwork. 6 months ago, he would have seen this place as beneath him. Now he saw it as more valuable than any of the restaurants he had owned. "I suppose I could," Marcus said slowly. "I mean, they could probably use the help." "They definitely could," Sergeant Chin confirmed. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned they're looking for someone to help coordinate the weekend maintenance projects." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Patterson herself, an energetic woman in her 70s who had been running the literacy program for over a decade. "Sarah, dear, I see you've met our Marcus," Mrs. Patterson said, bustling into the room with her arms full of new books. "He's been absolutely wonderful these past 6 months. I don't know what we'll do without him." "Actually," Marcus said, surprising himself, "I was just thinking that maybe I don't have to leave." Mrs. Patterson stopped in her tracks, her eyes lighting up with hope. "You mean you'd like to keep volunteering? Even after your service is completed? If you'll have me." Mrs. Patterson clapped her hands together in delight. "Oh, my dear boy, of course we'll have you. We've been dreading losing you. The work you've done on our facilities has been simply wonderful." Marcus felt a warmth spreading through his chest, a sense of being valued for something other than his money or his ability to intimidate people. It was a feeling he was still getting used to, but one he found he liked very much. "There's something else," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "I've been thinking about this for weeks now. I want to do more than just weekend maintenance. I want to start a program." "What kind of program?" Sergeant Chen asked, her professional interest clearly engaged. "A program for people like me. People who have made serious mistakes and are looking for a way to make amends. Not just community service that gets assigned by a court, but real opportunities for people to contribute something meaningful while they figure out how to rebuild their lives." Mrs. Patterson was nodding enthusiastically. "That's a brilliant idea, Marcus. We have so many needs here, and there must be other people who would benefit from the kind of transformation you've experienced." Sergeant Chun was studying Marcus with the same intensity she had shown 6 months ago, but now her expression was thoughtful rather than wary. "You've really changed," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I have, and I owe that to you." "No," Sergeant Chun said firmly. "You don't owe it to me. I just showed you who you were. You did the work of becoming who you wanted to be." Marcus felt tears starting to form in his eyes again. Over the past 6 months, he had cried more than he had in the previous 20 years combined. But these weren't tears of shame or anger. They were tears of gratitude. "I want you to know something," Marcus said. 6 months ago, I thought I was successful because I had money and people were afraid of me. I thought respect was something you could take from people by force. You showed me what real respect looks like. You showed me what it means to earn something through service to others." Sergeant Chen smiled, and it was the first genuinely warm smile Marcus had seen from her. "Mr. Thompson, 6 months ago, I saw a man who had lost his way. Today, I see a man who has found his purpose. That's worth more than all the money in the world." As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself working alongside Sergeant Chun to help children with their reading. He discovered that she was as patient with struggling readers as she was disciplined in her military duties. She had a gift for making each child feel important and capable, regardless of their skill level. When the day's programs ended and the volunteers began cleaning up, Marcus found himself walking with Sergeant Chun toward the exit. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said as they reached the street. "Of course. Do you ever think about that day at Windsor Castle? Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been there?" Sergeant Chun considered this question carefully before answering. "I think about it sometimes, but not the way you might expect. I don't think about what would have happened to you or to that family. I think about what it means to be in the right place at the right time to help people who need help." They had reached Sergeant Chen's car, and she paused with her hand on the door handle. "Mr. Thompson, you asked me once if I knew who you were. Today, I think I finally do know who you are. You're someone who made mistakes, learned from them, and chose to use that experience to help other people avoid making the same mistakes. That's exactly the kind of person the world needs more of." Marcus watched her drive away, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt truly proud of himself. Not proud because he had intimidated someone or made money or gotten his way through force, but proud because he had earned the respect of someone whose opinion actually mattered. 6 months ago, Marcus Thompson had been a bully who used his size and wealth to take what he wanted from others. Today, he was a man who understood that the only things worth having in life were the things you earned through service to something larger than yourself. Tomorrow, Marcus would begin the work of building a new kind of life. A life based not on what he could take from others, but on what he could give. It wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't be as profitable as his old life had been. But it would be meaningful in a way that money could never be. As Marcus walked home through the London streets, he passed the location where one of his former restaurants had operated. The space was empty now, with a "for rent" sign in the window. 6 months ago, the sight would have filled him with regret and anger. Today, it filled him with something else entirely: excitement for the possibilities that lay ahead. Marcus Thompson had learned the hardest lesson of his life from Sergeant Sarah Chun. He had learned that true strength comes not from the ability to dominate others, but from the willingness to serve them. And, in learning that lesson, he had discovered something he had never known he was looking for: a reason to be proud of the man he was becoming, rather than ashamed of the man he had been. The police station in Windsor was not the kind of place Marcus Thompson had ever expected to find himself. The building was old but well-maintained, with fluorescent lights that hummed quietly overhead, and the smell of industrial cleaning products that couldn't quite mask the underlying odors of fear, desperation, and regret that seemed to permeate all police stations everywhere. Marcus sat in an interview room, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his designer watch reflecting the harsh overhead lighting. His wrists were sore from the handcuffs, and his shoulder ached from where Sergeant Chun had controlled him so effortlessly. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the psychological shock he was still processing. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus Thompson had encountered someone who was completely immune to his usual methods of getting what he wanted. Money meant nothing to Sergeant Chun. Physical intimidation had backfired spectacularly. His reputation, which opened doors and solved problems throughout London's underworld, was worse than useless here. It was actively working against him. Detective Inspector Williams sat across from Marcus, reviewing a file that seemed surprisingly thick for an incident that had occurred just 2 hours earlier. Williams was a man in his early 50s with gray hair and the patient expression of someone who had seen every type of criminal justification imaginable. "Mr. Thompson," Detective Inspector Williams said without looking up from his file, "you've had quite a morning." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his plastic chair. "This is all a misunderstanding. I was just trying to get to an important meeting, and some tourist family was blocking my way. Then, that woman attacked me." Williams finally looked up, his expression suggesting he had heard more creative lies before lunch. "Attacked you? Mr. Thompson, we have statements from 17 witnesses, plus video footage from 12 different phones. Would you like to revise your version of events?" The detective opened his laptop and turned it toward Marcus. On the screen was a crystal-clear video showing the entire confrontation from multiple angles. Marcus watched himself threatening the tourist family, dismissing Sergeant Chin's initial request to move along, and, finally, reaching out to grab her shoulder before finding himself face down on the cobblestones. "That woman is trained to kill people," Marcus said, his voice rising. "She used excessive force. I barely touched her, and she attacked me like some kind of martial arts expert." "Sergeant Chun is indeed trained in combat," Detective Inspector Williams acknowledged. "She's also trained in threat assessment, de-escalation, and the appropriate use of force. According to her statement, she asked you to leave 3 times before you physically approached her in a threatening manner." Marcus watched the video again, and even he had to admit that his behavior looked worse on screen than it had felt in the moment. The camera captured his aggressive posture, his raised voice, the way he had loomed over the tourist family, and later over Sergeant Chin herself. It also captured her calm professionalism, her repeated attempts to resolve the situation peacefully, and the precise, controlled way she had neutralized his attack. "I want to speak to my lawyer," Marcus said finally. "Of course. But first, let me make sure you understand your situation. You're being charged with disturbing the peace, threatening behavior, and attempted assault. The attempted assault charge is particularly serious because it was directed at a member of the Queen's Guard while she was off duty." Marcus felt his stomach drop. Off duty. Sergeant Chun was visiting Windsor Castle with her family. She's been on leave for the past week. She intervened in your confrontation as a private citizen, not as a royal guard, which means she showed remarkable restraint in how she handled you. The implication hit Marcus like a physical blow. If this was how Sergeant Chun handled threats while she was relaxing with her family, he couldn't imagine what she might have done if she had been on official duty and perceived him as a genuine threat to royal security. "I didn't know who she was," Marcus said weakly. "No, you didn't. And that's exactly the problem." Detective Inspector Williams closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Thompson, in my 28 years as a police officer, I've met a lot of men like you. Successful businessmen who believe their money and their size give them the right to intimidate anyone who inconveniences them." Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but Williams held up a hand. "I'm not finished. What you encountered this morning was something you've probably never had to deal with before. Someone whose authority comes from service, not from wealth or physical intimidation. Sergeant Chun has earned her position through years of training, discipline, and dedication to something larger than herself. She doesn't need to threaten people to get respect because she's actually worthy of it. The words stung because Marcus recognized their truth. His entire adult life had been built on making people afraid of him, on using his size and his money to force the world to bend to his will. He had never considered what it might feel like to earn respect through service or sacrifice. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now you call your lawyer, and we proceed with the charges. But before you do that, I want to tell you something about Sergeant Chun that might interest you." Williams opened his file again and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Sarah Chun joined the Army at 18 years old. She served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a medic, saving lives under fire. She was awarded the Military Cross for bravery after she single-handedly evacuated 6 wounded soldiers from a building under enemy attack. When she returned to the UK, she applied for the Queen's Guard and completed one of the most demanding training programs in the military. Marcus listened without interrupting, beginning to understand that his morning encounter had been even more one-sided than he had realized. Sergeant Chin speaks 4 languages fluently. She holds a black belt in 3 different martial arts. She's trained in anti-terrorism, crowd control, and dignitary protection. She can shoot with precision at ranges most people can't even see clearly. And this morning, when you tried to intimidate her, she treated you with far more patience and gentleness than you deserved. Williams closed the file and looked directly at Marcus. "The point, Mr. Thompson, is that you picked a fight with someone who could have ended your threat in any number of ways. And she chose the most merciful option available. That should tell you something about the kind of person she is and the kind of person you've been." Marcus stared at the table, processing this information. He had always thought of himself as tough, as someone who could handle any confrontation. But he was beginning to realize that he had never actually faced a real challenge. The people he had intimidated over the years, restaurant employees, business rivals, anyone who had crossed him, they had backed down because they had something to lose, not because he was actually dangerous. "I want to apologize to her," Marcus said suddenly. Detective Inspector Williams raised an eyebrow. "That's unexpected." "I mean it. I want to apologize to her and to that family I was threatening. I want to make this right. Mr. Thompson, you're facing criminal charges. An apology isn't going to make those disappear. I know, but I still want to do it." Williams studied Marcus for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this change of heart was genuine or just another manipulation. "I'll pass along your request, but Sergeant Chun is under no obligation to speak with you. And I strongly recommend you talk to your lawyer before making any statements." Marcus nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the look in Sergeant Chen's eyes when she had pinned him to the ground. There had been no anger there, no satisfaction at having defeated him, just professional competence and perhaps a hint of disappointment that the situation had escalated to violence. An hour later, Marcus's lawyer arrived. James Holloway was exactly the type of legal representation Marcus's money could buy: expensive, ruthless, and completely uninterested in whether his clients were actually guilty of the charges against them. Holloway wore a suit that cost more than most people's cars and carried a briefcase that probably cost more than most people's rent. "Marcus, what the hell happened?" Holloway demanded as soon as he sat down. "I get a call that you've been arrested for assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard? Are you completely insane?" Marcus explained the morning's events, and he found that telling the story to his lawyer felt different from telling it to the detective. With Williams, he had felt defensive and embarrassed. With Holloway, he felt something else, ashamed. "This is manageable," Holloway said when Marcus finished. "We'll argue that you were under stress about your brother's situation, that you didn't realize the woman was military, and that you barely touched her before she used excessive force. We can probably get the charges reduced to a simple disturbance." "I don't want the charges reduced," Marcus said quietly. Holloway looked at his client as if Marcus had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "Excuse me. I said I don't want the charges reduced. I did what they said I did. I threatened that family, and I tried to grab Sergeant Chun. I want to plead guilty." "Marcus, have you hit your head? Do you understand what a conviction could mean for your businesses? For your reputation?" Marcus almost laughed at that. His reputation was built on being a bully who could intimidate anyone who crossed him. This morning had proven that reputation was built on sand. "Maybe it's time for a new reputation," Marcus said. Holloway spent the next 20 minutes trying to talk Marcus out of his decision, but Marcus had made up his mind. He would plead guilty to the charges, accept whatever punishment the court deemed appropriate, and try to find a way to apologize to the people he had wronged. Later that afternoon, Detective Inspector Williams returned to the interview room with surprising news. "Sergeant Chun has agreed to meet with you," Williams said. Against the advice of her commanding officer, and probably against her better judgment, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and terror. He wanted to apologize, but he wasn't sure he was ready to face the woman who had so completely dismantled his worldview in the span of 3 seconds. Now, if you're ready. She's here with her family. They never did get to finish their tour of the castle." Williams led Marcus to a small conference room where Sergeant Chun waited with a man and woman who were obviously her parents, and a little boy who looked to be about 8 years old. Seeing her in this context, as a daughter and sister rather than as the professional warrior who had defeated him, Marcus felt a new wave of shame about his behavior. Sergeant Chin stood when Marcus entered the room. She was wearing the same casual clothes from that morning, but now Marcus could see details he had missed before. The way she carried herself spoke of confidence earned through experience. Her eyes were alert, but kind. There was nothing about her appearance that should have warned him he was challenging one of the most dangerous women in Britain, which made his defeat all the more humbling. "Mr. Thompson," she said with a nod. "Sergeant Chun, I wanted to apologize." "I'm listening." Marcus had prepared a speech in his head, but, faced with her calm attention, the words came out differently than he had planned. "I've spent my whole life thinking that being bigger and richer than other people gave me the right to treat them however I wanted. This morning, you showed me that I was wrong. Not just wrong about you, but wrong about everything. I'm sorry for threatening you, for threatening that family, and for being the kind of person who thought that was acceptable." Sergeant Chin studied his face for a moment, and Marcus had the uncomfortable feeling that she was reading things about him that he hadn't even said. "Mr. Thompson, do you know why I became a soldier?" The question caught Marcus off guard. "No, ma'am. I became a soldier because I believe that people who are capable of protecting others have a responsibility to do so. That family you threatened this morning, they were just trying to enjoy a day out with their daughter. They didn't deserve to be intimidated because they inconvenienced you." Marcus nodded, feeling smaller with each word. "I didn't defend them because I dislike you personally. I defended them because it was the right thing to do. And when you tried to grab me, I stopped you with the minimum force necessary because that's what my training taught me to do." She paused, and Marcus realized she was giving him time to absorb what she was saying. "Your apology is accepted, Mr. Thompson. But apologizing to me isn't enough. You need to figure out what kind of person you want to be going forward." Marcus looked at her family, her parents, who were obviously proud of their daughter, and her little brother, who was looking at Marcus with the frank curiosity of childhood. "Your brother looks up to you," Marcus said. "He does. And someday, when he's old enough to understand, I'll tell him about this morning. I'll tell him that even when people make mistakes, even serious mistakes, they can choose to do better." Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes, which surprised him. He couldn't remember the last time he had cried. "I want to do better," he said simply. "Then, do better," Sergeant Chin replied. "It's that simple and that difficult." As Marcus left the police station that afternoon, he carried with him the knowledge that his old life, built on intimidation and maintained through fear, was over. He didn't know what would replace it, but for the first time in years, he felt something that might have been hope. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Windsor as Marcus Thompson adjusted his expensive watch and straightened his designer tie. At 32, Marcus had built his reputation on intimidation and his wallet on questionable business deals. Standing 6 feet 3 inches with broad shoulders and a permanent scowl, he looked like the kind of man who got his way through sheer presence alone. Marcus owned 3 restaurants in central London, each one a front for money laundering operations that had made him wealthy beyond his legitimate means. He drove a black Range Rover, wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and carried himself with the arrogance of a man who believed rules applied to everyone except him. This particular morning, Marcus had business in Windsor. Not the kind of business he usually conducted in backroom meetings with suspicious characters, but something far more personal. His younger brother Danny had been arrested 3 days earlier for assault outside a pub in Windsor Great Park. The victim was a tourist who had apparently said something Danny didn't like about English football. Marcus parked his Range Rover in a spot clearly marked for disabled visitors outside the Windsor Castle Visitor Center. He didn't bother looking at the sign. Parking rules, like most rules, were suggestions that didn't apply to him. He had learned long ago that money and intimidation could solve most problems, and the few problems they couldn't solve usually weren't worth his time. The castle grounds buzzed with early morning activity. Tour groups gathered around their guides, listening to rehearsed speeches about 800 years of royal history. Families posed for photos in front of the ancient stone walls. Children pointed excitedly at the towers rising into the cloudy sky. Marcus pushed through the crowd without apology, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke loudly about his brother's situation. Several tourists stepped aside, recognizing the type of man who expected others to move out of his way. His voice carried across the courtyard as he discussed bail money and legal fees with someone on the other end of the call. "I don't care what it costs," Marcus said into his phone, his voice rising above the chatter of tourists. "Danny's my brother, and he's not spending another night in that cell. You get him out today, or I'll find someone who can." A small girl, maybe 7 years old, was trying to take a photo of her parents in front of the round tower when Marcus walked directly through her shot. The child's mother, a woman with kind eyes and a patient smile, gently touched Marcus's arm. "Excuse me, sir," she said politely. "Could you please step aside for just a moment? We're trying to take a family photo." Marcus stopped his phone conversation and looked down at the woman with the kind of expression normally reserved for something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of his shoe. "Move," he said simply, then continued walking. The woman's husband, a thin man wearing a university sweatshirt, stepped forward. "That's my wife you're talking to. Show some respect." Marcus ended his phone call and turned to face the man. The difference in their physical presence was immediately obvious. Where the husband was slim and scholarly, Marcus was thick and menacing. Where the husband had the soft hands of someone who worked with books or computers, Marcus had the scarred knuckles of someone who had settled many disagreements with his fists. "Your wife needs to learn when to keep her mouth shut," Marcus said, stepping closer to the man. "And you need to learn when to mind your own business." A small crowd began to form around them. Most tourists in these situations would have backed down, apologized, and moved on with their day. But the husband, perhaps inspired by his daughter watching, or perhaps simply tired of seeing bullies get their way, stood his ground. "We were here first," the husband said, his voice shaking slightly but his feet planted firmly. "We're not moving because you're in a hurry." Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. This was the smile of a predator who had found easy prey. He had been in this situation hundreds of times before. Someone would challenge him, he would make an example of them, and everyone else would fall in line. It was a simple system that had worked his entire adult life. "You know what?" Marcus said, rolling up his sleeves. "I think you need a lesson in manners." The crowd of tourists began to back away, sensing that the situation was about to turn violent. The woman pulled her daughter closer, her face pale with fear. The husband raised his hands, trying to de-escalate the situation, but Marcus had already made his decision. Just as Marcus was about to grab the man's shirt, a voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter. "Is there a problem here?" Everyone turned to see a woman approaching from the direction of the castle gates. She was perhaps 28 years old, average height, with brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore what appeared to be casual tourist clothing, jeans, comfortable walking shoes, and a light jacket. Nothing about her appearance suggested authority or danger. Marcus looked her up and down and dismissed her immediately. Another tourist who thought she could play peacekeeper. He had dealt with her type before too. "No problem that concerns you, sweetheart," Marcus said without taking his attention off the husband. "Keep walking." The woman stepped closer, moving with a fluid grace that Marcus completely missed. Her posture was relaxed, her hands open and non-threatening. But there was something in her eyes that should have warned him. This was not the look of someone who was afraid or uncertain. This was the look of someone who was professionally assessing a threat. "I think there is a problem," the woman said calmly. "You're intimidating these people, and you're disturbing the peace of this historic site. I'm going to have to ask you to move along." Marcus laughed out loud. The sound echoed off the ancient stone walls, harsh and mocking. Several tourists winced at the ugliness of it. "You're going to ask me?" Marcus repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Lady, do you have any idea who you're talking to?" The woman tilted her head slightly, studying Marcus with the same expression someone might use when examining an interesting, but not particularly dangerous insect. "Should I?" she asked simply. This response threw Marcus off balance. He was accustomed to people either knowing his reputation immediately or being quickly educated about it. Fear was usually instant once people understood what he was capable of. But this woman seemed genuinely unimpressed. "My name is Marcus Thompson," he said, puffing out his chest. "I own half the restaurants in London. I've got more money in my wallet right now than you'll see in 6 months. And if you don't walk away right now, you're going to find out exactly why people in this city know better than to mess with me." The woman nodded thoughtfully, as if she were considering this information carefully. Around them, the crowd of tourists watched nervously. Some were recording the confrontation on their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something that might become newsworthy. "That's very impressive," the woman said, and her tone suggested she meant the exact opposite. "But I'm still going to have to ask you to leave these people alone." Marcus's face began to turn red. This was not how these confrontations were supposed to go. By now, the woman should have been backing away, apologizing, maybe even offering him her phone number as a peace offering. Instead, she stood there looking at him like he was a mildly annoying child having a tantrum. "Listen carefully," Marcus said, stepping toward her until he was close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne he wore to mask the scent of cigarettes and aggression. "I don't know what fairy tale world you live in, but this is the real world. In the real world, people like me don't get told what to do by people like you." The woman didn't step back. She didn't flinch. She didn't show any of the signs of intimidation that Marcus had learned to read over years of bullying his way through life. Instead, she simply looked up at him with those calm, assessing eyes. "People like you?" she asked. "What kind of person do you think I am?" It was a simple question, but something about the way she asked it made Marcus feel suddenly uncertain. There was a stillness about her that he couldn't quite understand. It reminded him of something, but he couldn't place what. "You're nobody," Marcus said. But even as the words left his mouth, they sounded less convincing than usual. "You're just another tourist with a big mouth and no idea what you're getting into." The woman smiled then, and it was not the nervous smile of someone trying to defuse a situation. It was the confident smile of someone who knew something that Marcus didn't. "You might be surprised," she said quietly. Marcus had reached the limit of his patience. Talk was cheap, and he had a reputation to maintain. In his world, respect was earned through violence, and maintained through the fear of more violence. This woman was challenging him in front of witnesses, and that could not be allowed to stand. "That's it," Marcus snarled, reaching out to grab the woman's shoulder. "I've had enough of your mouth." What happened next would be replayed on social media thousands of times over the following weeks. But even in slow motion, most viewers would struggle to understand exactly how it occurred. Marcus's hand never reached the woman's shoulder. Instead, he found himself face down on the cobblestone courtyard with his arm twisted behind his back in a position that sent lightning bolts of pain up to his shoulder. The woman's knee was pressed against his spine, and her grip on his wrist was like a steel vise. The entire sequence had taken perhaps 3 seconds, and Marcus still wasn't entirely sure what had happened. One moment he had been reaching for her, confident in his superior size and strength. The next moment, the ancient stones of Windsor Castle were pressing against his cheek, and every attempt to move resulted in another spike of agony shooting through his arm and shoulder. "Let me go," Marcus shouted, his voice muffled by his position against the ground. "Do you know who I am? I'll have you arrested. I'll sue you for everything you own." The woman's voice came from directly above him, calm and professional. "Sir, you attempted to assault me after threatening multiple people. I defended myself using reasonable force. There are approximately 30 witnesses here, and at least a dozen of them are recording this on their phones." Marcus tried to push himself up with his free arm, but the woman adjusted her grip slightly, and a new wave of pain convinced him to stop moving. "This is assault," Marcus gasped. "Police. Somebody call the police." The police are already on their way, the woman said. Someone called them when you started threatening that family. Marcus twisted his head to look up at her, and, for the first time, he noticed details he had missed before. Her breathing was completely normal, as if restraining a man 50 pounds heavier than herself required no effort at all. Her grip on his wrist was precise and professional, designed to control without causing permanent damage. Most importantly, her eyes held the kind of alertness he had seen before in people who were accustomed to danger. "Who are you?" Marcus asked, some of the arrogance finally draining from his voice. Before the woman could answer, the sound of heavy boots on cobblestone announced the arrival of additional security. Marcus looked up to see two uniformed guards approaching at a quick pace. But these were not the typical security guards he was used to dealing with at his restaurants. These men moved with military precision, their hands resting casually on equipment Marcus couldn't quite identify. "Everything under control here, Sergeant?" one of the guards asked. Marcus's blood ran cold. "Sergeant?" The woman holding him down responded without looking away from Marcus. "Yes, sir." One individual disturbing the peace and attempting assault. Multiple witnesses. "Copy that." Local police are 30 seconds out. It was only then that Marcus began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. This wasn't just some tourist who had gotten lucky. The way the other guards deferred to her, the professional terminology, the ease with which she had disabled him. This woman was military. More than that, she was military of a very specific type. Royal Guard, Marcus whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. The woman finally looked down at him, and her expression was not unkind, but it was completely without sympathy. "Sergeant Sarah Chun, Queen's Guard, 2nd Battalion," she said. "And you, Mr. Thompson, have just learned why we're trained to deal with threats to royal security." The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, and Marcus realized that his morning had taken a turn he never could have anticipated. He had come to Windsor to solve his brother's legal problems, confident in his ability to intimidate and manipulate his way to a solution. Instead, he was about to be arrested by local police while being restrained by one of the most elite soldiers in the British military. As the police cars pulled up to the castle entrance, Marcus Thompson began to understand that there were some people in the world who truly didn't care how much money he had or how many restaurants he owned. Some people had earned their respect through service to something larger than themselves, and those people were not impressed by bullies who thought size and wealth made them untouchable. The tourist family he had been threatening watched from a safe distance as police officers approached. The little girl who had wanted to take a photo was now staring wide-eyed at the woman who had ended the confrontation with such decisive efficiency. "Is she really a soldier, Daddy?" the child whispered. Her father, still shaken from his own encounter with Marcus, nodded slowly. "Yes, sweetheart. She's one of the people who protect the Queen." As the police officers took control of the situation and Sergeant Chun released her grip on Marcus, allowing him to be handcuffed and helped to his feet, Marcus found himself looking at Windsor Castle with new eyes. He had thought of it as just another tourist attraction, a pile of old stones that people paid money to photograph. Now he understood that it was something else entirely, a place where people who had dedicated their lives to service stood ready to protect what they believed in, regardless of who might challenge them. Marcus Thompson's education in respect was just beginning, and he was about to discover that some lessons could not be bought, intimidated, or bullied away. They could only be learned through experience, and some experiences changed a person forever.